As Alyssa said, this is a project that we're quite familiar with, and having produced the urban design study in 2016, it's really exciting to see the progress that's been made. What I'm going to run through tonight is work in progress. I would still say we're kind of early days in this process, in the sense that we have not started developing design guidelines yet. What we've been doing is looking at a series of scenarios and kind of testing those scenarios. So what you will see are some images which are not intended to be designs, because we know that KPMB are probably going to be the likely architects for this site. But we do these kind of conceptual massing studies and design studies as a way to inform the guidelines. Okay, I'll just get control of this screen. So this is an extract from the 2016 study, and just a couple of things I've highlighted here is this notion that some diversity in building height and character is actually a really positive thing, and also to be mindful of maintaining this site as a public destination. So the issue of public parking on the site, I think, is still something that needs to be addressed. And potentially this process, in addition to leveraging more family units, hopefully will also be able to address this need for public parking. Another interesting aspect from the original study that is relevant to this site is that on the east side of Block 16, which was zoned institutional, there is this idea about a mid-block connection linking the greenway, which you can see is labeled as number 4, that east-west pedestrian greenway linking north to the waterfront promenade. So that's a kind of idea that we've resurrected as a way to help with thinking about the transition from the other blocks on Pier 8 and Block 16. Block 16 is a kind of exceptional site, both in the sense that it kind of terminates this this west end of the site, but it is also directly aligned with James Street. So anything we put there has the potential to have presence well beyond this site, deep within the city. So we've taken a look at 3 scenarios. The first one is a mid-rise scenario. And so that concept that I talked about in terms of this connection, we've started to think about the opportunity to create a kind of muse, pedestrian muse that links the greenway to the waterfront. And in this case, having both with Block 1 on the east and Block 16 on the west, having a low-rise component kind of lined with at-grade units. So this could be townhomes, it could be live-work units, but they would have actual front doors lining this mews, which would, you know, probably have beautiful kind of tree-lined walkway connecting to the waterfront. In order to achieve that mews, this does not have to be a public space. It can be what we call a POPS, or a privately owned public space. So there would be agreements which would permit the public to move through the space. So this is a three-dimensional view of the mid-rise concept, where what we've done is tested this idea of 3 stories on the mews, stepping up to a 12-story building. And you can see block 1 on the right-hand side has this 4-story building built right to the property line. So we're recommending in this scenario that there would be a kind of 12-meter setback to permit the mews to be located in that space. For each of these scenarios, we've been looking at shadow impacts, and with this 12-story version, we're seeing what looks like minimal shadow impact, kind of similar to the impact of other buildings along the waterfront. So in our estimation, not really a negative impact in terms of the shadow impacts on the promenade. Can you guys see that kind of scribble on the lower right image? Or is that just on my screen?
No, we can all see it there.
I have no idea what that is. Sorry, it must be something, some glitch. So if you'll bear with me. Anyway, on all of these, in all of these scenarios, we've tested what you would see from different vantage points within the city. So here we see images on the left, which is the existing condition, and then a model image on the right, which shows, you know, the massing and what you would see on block 16. So the mid-rise portion, you know, very similar in scale to the existing context on Pier 8. And this is an overall view looking at the built form of Pier 8 with the block 16 mid-rise massing. And this results in a building close to about 150,000 square feet. The next scenario looks at a tall building, and in this case, we started this review looking at a 30-story building. I would say the choice of 30 stories was somewhat arbitrary, but was informed by what is recommended as a maximum height for tall buildings in the downtown. Mind you, we're not in the downtown, but we just took this as a kind of starting point. So again, this idea of this connecting pedestrian mews, but in this case, because of the taller form of the tower, looking for a kind of wider width. So previously we had 12 meters, we're now recommending 15. And then anything above 3 stories would have a 25-meter separation distance. And in this case, it requires some modifications to the configuration of block 1 so that part of the muse is kind of on block 1 and the other half is on block 16. This is a conceptual sketch showing this idea of the muse, this tree-lined muse with at-grade kind of townhome units lining it with a public walkway down the middle. You know, probably a great place for live-work units, but also a great place for family-oriented units. And then we tested the shadows on the 30-story version. And the floor plate size, the kind of footprint of the tower, we were using 850 square meters. It has a fairly narrow profile, so the shadow impact actually moves quite rapidly across the site. And again, I think in our estimation, the impacts in terms of the promenade are acceptable. You'll see that a lot of the impact actually happens in the water. So as we go taller, the impact is pretty negligible since most of the shadow is happening in the water. And again, these are looking at different vantage perspectives of the 30-story version, looking down James Street. So the image on the top right and the bottom image on the right-hand side give you a sense of how this building has the capacity to kind of act as a landmark, as a kind of beacon for the harbor, so that anybody within the downtown or coming into Hamilton begins to understand that there's something different and new happening. So the idea of associating this opportunity kind of as a gesture marking the renewal of the harbor, I think is a kind of exciting potential. When we looked at this 30-story version, however, from a kind of iconic landmark perspective, our sense is, and this is purely a kind of aesthetic urban design analysis, was that at this height, the building is actually quite squat. It does not have the kind of elegance of a spire or a beacon. And here you can just see different vantage points. Jason Thorne also asked us to take a look at, for somebody arriving on the West Harbor GO Station platform, what is it that you could see? Was there an opportunity for this building to be recognized as this kind of marker for the harbor? And as you can see in this scenario, at 30 stories, we don't actually see anything. So the third scenario, we took a look at a taller building at 45 stories. And you could ask, how did we come up with 45 stories? So this is the explanation. We took a look at the height of the tallest building in Hamilton, which is Landmark Place in the downtown, which has a what we call a geodetic height. So its height sets a kind of datum of 226 meters. And that's basically above sea level. So we extended that height across to the harbor. And because the harbor lands are lower, with a 45-story, we could achieve, we could actually be just under that geodetic height of the tallest building in Hamilton. One of the reasons we took this approach was trying not to set a precedent for buildings that would go beyond what is presently the tallest structure in Hamilton. So this is how we came up with the 45 stories. And here you can see the same kind of datum extended from the downtown to a harbor. And we also took a couple of views as you approach the city from the bridges. And you can see that very clearly this is beginning to act as this kind of beacon, harbor beacon, the signature associated with the renewal of the harbor. And also from the Skyway. So this is identical to the 30-story version, where we're recommending this muse with a separation of 15 meters for the lower portions, a 3-story base, and then a 25-meter separation distance between the taller elements of the site. And again, the same view of the muse. So here we started to take a look at, if you just recall my analysis of the 30-story building being this kind of slightly awkward and squat building, looked at scenarios of how this proportionally, I think, could be a much more elegant building, starting with a floor plate of about 850 square meters. But as we go up, it thins out to a 650 square meter floor plate. So it's tapering as it goes higher. And as I said, this is not a design, it's just testing different configurations for how this tower could be deployed. In this case, a kind of rectangular form with its thin side facing James Street. A more kind of angular form, and a kind of circular or ovoid form, which has the advantage of helping with wind mitigation because of its form. So again, we tested this from a shadow impact perspective, and you can see the shadow impacts are pretty much identical to the 30-story version between these test times of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And here you begin to see, what is clearly a very strong statement at Pier 8, very visible from all kinds of vantage points in the city. looking down James Street. So I think we felt that this 45-story version actually had the potential to create a kind of excitement about this renewal of the harbor and become a kind of symbol of the harbor renewal. And it would be a real kind of signature building for Hamilton. Again, looking at some other vantage points and from far off. And even from the GO Station platform, you begin to see the upper stories of this building peeking above on the horizon. So as I said, our job is to translate these scenarios into guidelines. But I've said in the past and in our previous meeting with the Planning Committee that design guidelines do not create beautiful buildings. I think we take a lot of comfort knowing that Waterfront Shores and KPMB are likely to be the team to make this project a reality. It has to be an exceptional building, I think, in order to create this kind of landmark that when people see it from anywhere in Hamilton, they feel good about it, they feel positive about it. And as I said to Herman, it's as simple as when people look at it, it should make them happy. So you'll see that the scale of this results in a building that's getting close to 400,000 square feet. So a substantial number of units, could be up to 400 units within this building. The interesting thing about that is obviously it triggers the additional family units because we're above 31 stories. But it also means because we're still at 1,645 units overall, that the scale of some of the other mid-rise buildings will probably have less units, which conversely could free up pressure for parking to service those units, enabling some spaces in those parking garages to be allocated for public parking. So that whole kind of mix is something we feel has a lot of potential to address both the desire for family units, but also the desire to have sufficient public parking on this site, because we know that everybody from Hamilton is going to want to come down and experience this promenade, as well as visitors. So this is the final slide and just kind of, again, an extract from the original 2016 study, just underscoring what we were emphasizing in there is to create a strategy that makes sure that there is sufficient public parking within Pier 8. And with that, I will hand it over to the next speaker.